Meredith, thank you so much for joining. To everyone who's tuning in, thank you so much for joining in the latest edition of Weekly Knowledge Nuggets. As always, I'm your host, Nick Freund, the founder of WorkStream.io, and I am really excited to have Meredith Alder come and join us today. She's going to talk to us all about SQL. And among her many accolades, she's an advanced SQL instructor at CoRise. So Meredith, maybe just kick us off, take us away. Give everyone who's listening in just like a quick introduction to yourself and your background.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Nick, and thanks for having me today.
Of course.
I am a SQL instructor as well as a data engineer. I've been working with data for all of my career. At the beginning, it was more designing and building databases to support applications. And about 10 years ago, I transitioned into the warehouse and building analytics and really using SQL to learn more about the business. But I have been working with it for quite some time, I love writing SQL and optimizing. I think is my favorite part is performance optimization with SQL.
Very cool. And how did you get into the gig as an instructor of SQL? Like how did that come about?
Yeah, so CoRise, as they were building up their curriculum, I teach the Advanced SQL, which is the third of the SQL courses. They have a really great like crash course to get people started, and then my class comes in at the end. It's part of the analytics engineering track, so you can also learn DBT as well as data modeling as part of that. So, just word of mouth, the people at CoRise are wonderful to work with. So, when they had a class in mind for me to teach, I was extremely excited to join them.
Very cool. Well, I guess big shout out then to CoRise, and anyone who's looking to upskill themselves in SQL should look at joining Meredith's class. So Meredith, I think to maybe just get us started, we obviously have been pronouncing it so far on this show, but how do you pronounce it? Is it SQL? Do you pronounce it SQL? Is there a right way? Is there a wrong way?
I hear people do both. When it very If we go back into history, it was in the 1970s when this language was first introduced in more of an academic setting. And it was called sequel, spelled the same as a movie sequel, but all capital letters. And then as it became more of a product and something that was sold, it was shortened to SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language. So, really, either option is completely correct. I think it's easier to say SQL than it is to say SQL. I don't normally like talking in acronyms, but there are people who feel very strongly about calling it SQL. So they're absolutely right as well.
Super interesting. So it sounds like you know a bunch about the history of the development of SQL all the way back to the 70s. Are there any other than my trying to get you to take a strong position about the naming of SQL versus SQL? Is there anything interesting about the history of this language that you think would be worth talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fascinating. When we work in a time of constantly changing technology, that something like SQL has been so deeply embedded in how we communicate and how we understand data for close to 50 years now. I think the first commercial product version of SQL was in 1974. So we're coming very close on 50 years.
That's
And
crazy.
it's kind of it's varied over the years. Microsoft has a product called Microsoft SQL Server, which is more than just the language. It's a complete suite of tools to develop and manage your environments. It's really grown beyond a language, but really at the core, that language, while it's changed over the years, it's super interesting to me that it's still in such high demand. And it's something that as people enter any type of tech role right now, and Python's up there as well. But SQL is very much a staple of really any professional data practitioner. They are likely going to be working with SQL. So to me, that's super interesting in these times of changing tech, that there's something that people were working with back in the 80s. And of course, it's grown and it's expanded since then. But that core functionality of SQL has lasted. And it really now is, I would say, more popular than ever. When I
Yeah. No, go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I worked as an application developer, it wasn't really, like a skill you would even put on your resume. It was just something that we assumed, everybody has to be able to look at the data, to learn about the data. Um, and yeah, it's great to see how mainstream it's become, especially in the analytics world.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's clearly the workhorse of data professionals and of analytics. The use cases, they are much broader than that for application development. But yeah, I mean, to your point, it is interesting to think that this language is 50 years old, and it's more popular than ever. You mentioned DBT as being part of your advanced SQL course. I mean, they didn't even support any other language until I don't know, 6 months ago, something like that. So I think that speaks to just the centrality this has to anyone who needs to understand or manipulate data.
I agree with that, and I also think it's really bigger than when we talk about people on data teams, within an organization. I think being fluent in SQL, even if you're not comfortable writing queries, being able to understand it is such a great way for multiple people within the organization to understand, the business processes. It's such a powerful way to express data in terms that make sense to humans. So I feel that it is a really valuable tool in addition to being a language to manipulate data.
Totally agree with you there, and I want to dive more into that a little bit later in our conversation. But from my personal experience, even I mean, I mean, I first learned SQL and wrote my first query when I was like 18 years old, right? And I'm never it's like half of the conversations I have with folks on the show, I'm always talking about how I'm like the worst data, like pure play data analyst ever. But I've known how to write SQL even in my middling fashion for most of my life, and it's been very valuable in a lot of different ways and during a lot of different times. So I think as a skill or tool set for data people, obviously incredibly central and important. But I think more broadly, just like a really valuable and important skill set for business people in general.
Definitely. I agree.
Cool. Well, so to go back maybe a little bit to your CoRise course. So you'd said that there's kind of like three levels, right?
Mhm.
When you kind of think about your advanced course, like what are the types of folks that you find attending that, and how do you think of in general, like kind of those breakpoints between like basic SQL knowledge? I would imagine there's like an intermediate level because you said three, and then
Mhm.
advanced. Like what does that look like?
So basic, I think, is you're just really getting comfortable with the terms and the language and the parts of a query. So, really, the hardest part of anything is getting started and having the confidence to say, I can be proficient in this without knowing everything. But in a basic level, you're just starting to understand the pieces of the query, and you can put together a query to answer a question. In intermediate, you build a little bit more on that in terms of we're aggregating data. How do we present the data? How do we manipulate it to the format that we need? And then I would say in intermediate, you kind of start thinking about joining different types of data sets and how do we get data from multiple places to answer a question. But I can speak in more detail about the advanced course,
Yeah.
which
So no, before you do that, just because oftentimes we have like a pretty diverse audience who watches
Mhm.
this. Some very very technical data people. Some other folks aren't. Like we're just throwing out like this term query. Like how would you to someone who's never like touched SQL? Like what would you describe a query to be?
Yeah. So when you are working with a data environment, you have some type of UI that allows you to communicate with that data storage. So what we use in my class is Snowflake. And so instead of installing anything on your machine, you really just need credentials and you can navigate in Chrome to an editor. And then within that editor, a query is just a statement. You're asking for some piece of data. We could start with a select statement so that we can see a data result. And then that comes back to you right in that same UI, usually in a grid format. And once you execute that query, you get the results back in the grid. And then also you're able to explore and see what are all the different tables, what are the different columns, so that you know the information that's available for you to query. But a query is really nothing more than a SQL command. You're telling SQL to do something. So primarily you're selecting some data from whatever source data that you have in a select statement. And that would be referred to as a query.
Cool. Well, thank you for entertaining me on that one. But just want to make sure everyone is on the same page with exactly what we're talking about, even if you're just a general or general business person who's watching this. But anyways, Meredith, where you were going though was you were going to talk more about kind of advanced
Mhm.
SQL and what that course might look like. So you kind of just finished up. What you think intermediate was, which is a lot about pulling data from multiple sources, starting to manipulate it, but then like how does that then kind of advance further from there?
Right. So I think once you've gotten through an intermediate course, you should be able, always as good developers with Google handy, you should be able to do pretty much anything in terms of answering a question at the intermediate level. You might have to Google the syntax or look for examples of syntax, but really you should be able to write the query to get the information that you need. When we go to the advanced class, we start talking about the quality of how you're writing the SQL. So we do talk about some more elegant methods, things like window functions or different ways to organize your code so that you're writing less code. At an intermediate level, you can write the code and get the result. But the first step is using some SQL functionality to make your code a little more elegant so you're not reinventing the wheel every time. And we talk a lot in the beginning about accuracy and understanding some of the pitfalls in the data and data quality that you really, as a more advanced SQL user, you know to look for those things. So if you have source data, you're able to dig into that source data, see how it's formatted so you can really understand those joins that you create between different sources. And you can identify common data problems, data quality problems, things like duplicate records, perhaps missing data. And that's the first week is really just getting that basic fundamental down
Hmm.
of working with the data. And then after that, I think we move into the really important parts, which are creating code that is understandable. So we're going to organize, even though we could already write the SQL query, we're going to structure it and organize it in a way that the next person is able to pick that up, understand it, and expand upon it. And that really is the second week. And then in the third week, the really more complicated and super fun part is thinking about the performance of our query,
Hmm.
and making sure that we're not wastefully using Snowflake time. that we're really writing the query to be more efficient. And then I have another week at the end after we've gone through those 3 things to pull it all together and just practice it in exercises. And that is the 4-week rundown of Advanced SQL.
Very cool. Is this like full? And I apologize. I should have looked. Is this like a I'm with Meredith all day long, every day type of thing? Like how much? What's the time commitment to this?
Yeah, so that's really the great thing about CoRise is it's a community-based learning. So as far as me as the instructor, I do every week, I do a lecture and then a hands-on live coding session, as well as sometimes we'll bring in other people who work with SQL to tell their stories. So that's really the classroom portion is about 2 hours a week for 4 weeks. Then there's also optional working sessions, there's study groups, and we have a constant conversation in Slack. So something that I find is if someone starts a discussion or has a question, there's a lot of other people chiming in. So it's not
Yeah.
just my perspective on everything, which I really appreciate about CoRise. It is a very interactive format. But the homework, takes depending on the level of the learner's experience with SQL, it takes probably anywhere from 2 to 4 hours a week to complete the project. And we do 1 project each week.
Very cool. So like I mentioned to you, I've used SQL in some way, shape, or form my entire career. There are times where I'm writing more SQL than others. To be honest with you, I haven't written very much SQL right now. So like every time I get back into it, I feel inadequate to say the least. Even though I've maybe crossed over at some points in my life into being more like an intermediate type of person, right? And I think that like comes down to just like practice, like how often am I incorporating it? When someone comes out of like a SQL boot camp or a training course, like what do you think needs to happen after that for someone to kind of to really be more fluent in it, right?
Mhm.
Like, is it like a 10,000 hours type of thing? I mean, what do you see like create success for folks longer term?
Yeah, so I think the boot camp or, a 4-week advanced class or a track like they have at CoRise, it establishes a really good baseline. So I think of SQL very similar to, learning a foreign language, right? So I took French when I was growing up and I couldn't write an article in French, but if I heard people speaking it, I'd be able to pick up the gist of what they're saying. And so I think having that skill is something that you can get from a boot camp, and it's something that you can get from going through one of these learning tracks to where when you're presented with a SQL query, you might not be able to build that yourself, but being able to understand it is a very
Yeah.
powerful skill. As far as building it yourself, there's so much functionality and so many things that SQL can do that I would hesitate to say that anyone is going to be completely fluent at SQL. It really depends on what you're using. And whatever you're doing day to day, I would say when you get to the end of a boot camp or you get to the end of a class, you should be familiar enough to recognize it when you see it and able to, of course, like I said, with help, you might not have that syntax like right there in your brain, but oh, I know how to aggregate. I know that group by, and I can use a window function. So you might have to look at some examples or do some Googling,
Hmm.
but you can get there. If you're using it every day at work, it's going to be very natural for you to get there. So I think that you can be proficient in SQL, but the practice makes you get there faster. So a query that, might take you 3 hours is something that's just very natural for you to produce. But I would argue that, once you've learned those pieces, even if they're not top of mind constantly, just going through the process of understanding what the options are really helps you construct that later. Practice, though. Yeah,
practice, right?
Yeah.
Here's where I'm always, I get in there and I really need an answer to some question, and I'm trying to construct my query. I'm like, I haven't practiced this in so long. I'm so rusty. So I would assume that in your course, you're seeing lots of data people. I mean, you're teaching the advanced course, so it's like people who are pretty proficient and whose jobs have them writing SQL all the time. More broadly, you've worked, for a long time in lots of different organizations. Like, I'm sure you've thought about this. Like, who in an organization do you think should know, like, some basic SQL skills? Like, do you think it's like literally everyone? Like, everyone should be able to have some base level of proficiency here, or do you think it's more valuable for specific roles or specific functions?
Right. Well, obviously, working directly with the data or trying to find answers to your questions, SQL will make you better at whatever job you have. If you're in finance or if you're in marketing, being able to get those numbers on your own and being able to research within the data. Oftentimes, I find data teams, when they provide a dashboard or a report, it just sort of scratches the surface. It gives the business teams enough information to lead them down the path of what they really need. So I think there is a lot of benefit for anyone to be able to work with the data, do some exploration, do some discovery, and answer the basic questions that lead to what are the really interesting questions. Obviously, if you're at an organization that has a very available data team and your work isn't delayed, you have like completely unlimited access to data resources, it might not be as important. I have personally have not seen an organization that runs that way. There's always more need for answers to questions than there are people waiting around to do that work. So I've seen people in marketing, people in finance, who are very proficient with SQL, and they are able to answer some of their own questions.
What about, like, have you ever seen, like, I don't know, like lots of salespeople, like sales development people being able to write SQL? I mean,
Yeah.
I generally agree with everything that you're saying. I'm just curious, like, have you seen a lot of that?
Yeah, I think ability is something that really anyone that is patient and open-minded to learning SQL, it is a very learnable language. And I think there's two steps to when we say that you're proficient in SQL. I think really anyone, regardless of what their role is, if they're selling, any person can write kind of a one-time use query to answer a burning question. And I think that that's important for everyone in the org to be able to do. Where I'd say that you're more of an advanced user, and what a person who's an analytics engineer or a data analyst, the skill that they need to have is to be able to write reusable SQL and something that becomes part of a regular process. But as far as those one-time answering questions, I think really everyone should challenge themselves to say, I'm going to learn a little bit of SQL. I'm going to be able to answer some questions on my own and get that answer exactly when I need it. It's a really powerful tool. And I think regardless of role, it really is a very good career move to be able to answer your own questions with the data.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Definitely would plus one that. And I think one of the things that you brought up that is very true is that the basics are very approachable, and you can get a lot of value through not a lot of effort in trying to teach yourself, like, a basic select statement. Even just knowing how to select everything from a specific table can give you a ton of information, and it's certainly a much better way of getting at it often than asking your data person, who's a much better use of their time.
Yes. The caveat to that is when we start talking about self-service analytics, it's very powerful for people to be able to answer their questions, but it can be a little bit dangerous in terms of what source data they're using to answer those questions. And that's really the hard part. So, Nick, so far when we've talked about SQL, I'm thinking of it more in like kind of a little bubble of, this is SQL, and are you able to learn the syntax and write your own queries? The
Yeah, I'm
answer,
thinking of like user in a SQL editor, like actually writing the code is what I've been thinking during this conversation.
right. And that is absolutely accessible. And I would recommend that people, not be intimidated by doing that. However, where things do get tricky is that organizational data and understanding where the source of truth is, what data has been transformed, what data has, where it came from, what kind of conditions about the data. And that's always going to be the hardest part. So that's why I
100%.
yeah, the one-time queries and the exploration of data is super powerful. But in order to create something that's dependable, that is accurate, that is a little bit more involved.
For sure. I mean, I think that's where, and I'm curious to get your opinion or perspective on this, where to an extent the promise of a lot of like self-service analytics tooling comes in, right? Because you can go give somebody access to Snowflake, right? And say, hey, go like knock yourself out with like querying the data. But that opens up a lot of potential like dangerous paths for them, especially if they're making a decision based off of it, versus, as an example, curating some type of data set in a more of like a no code tool where now, hey, this data has been more blessed by the folks in the data team who are charged with building reusable assets, right?
Yeah.
So I would just be curious, like, do you think self-service, like these SQL, like as good as the idea is that like we could all be like a little bit SQL proficient, do you think that like the kind of the use of these self-service analytics tools is more of what should happen, or do you think that maybe we've like swung too far that way and folks should be comfortable and potentially doing a little bit of both? Like, any opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a challenge for most organizations, and I've found it to be an added challenge since we've kind of moved into this ELT world where there is so much data within the warehouse. And one thing that I've seen in multiple organizations is there's lots of people that come to the organization and they say, "Oh, I've worked with Salesforce in other jobs. I just want the raw Salesforce data and I'll do my own querying," which can be okay. But there's often caveats in the organization where Salesforce doesn't tell the whole story. It needs to be combined with perhaps like a
Mhm.
financial system, something else. And so that's where I say there's a lot of preparation involved. And if that data is very clearly cataloged and we've transformed it and we know that it's a source of truth, then self-service analytics becomes possible. Um, the problem that I see often is that a lot of people are doing the same type of logic in different ways, and then that source of truth is really hard to identify in an organization.
The logic itself is different, right?
Right.
Which then impacts the source of truth. Yeah.
Yeah, and oftentimes different departments view things differently. And even just in a conversational before we get to the actual data, um, they don't define some of their metrics exactly the same way. So that it's a little bit tricky, but I think when we catalog and properly transform the data, at that point, I think self-service is very powerful.
But to you, that's more the caveat as opposed to the interface by which the end user self-services, right? Like, you think those are the important things, not necessarily like, hey, we should be getting this thing in data set mode or like a looker explore. Like, it sounds like the interaction form factor there you think is less of the key important piece.
Yeah, it's not to me, it's not as important. I think once we have that data that has been validated and tested and is made available, I kind of like to let the different departments, different users choose how to interact with that data. I mean, some people are very happy with Looker and they like having those dashboards. And then some people, they don't know exactly what they're looking for in the data and they just want to get in there, whether it's with mode or hex or just directly looking at, a query editor. They just want to get in there and start exploring and say, okay, of this population of customers, what percentage have this attribute? It's not something that they might ever want to reuse or package. I think of Looker or tools like BI tools, it's really a deliverable. So they're
Mm-hmm.
metrics that we've decided are useful. And I guess I'm not really too biased towards any particular BI tool. I think it's good to be flexible and people can work with what they're comfortable with.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is you don't have an opinion one way or the other. What is your end user comfortable doing? Self-serving by writing SQL themselves, or maybe they want something that's a little bit more plug and play, and that's fine regardless of what you choose. It's really these other things around
Mhm.
testing and quality and transformation that are the most important, which I think makes
Yeah.
sense.
That's my focus is really on the preparation of the data, and then consumers can choose how they want to use that data, how they want to visualize it. But preparing it and making sure that it's accurate is really, I think, the primary focus.
Makes total sense. So I guess taking a step back, and we're kind of at time, or running up on time now. When you kind of think to when you kind of if you put on your business leader hat or your leader hat, uh, we've talked, I think, a lot about, I think, some of the benefits of teaching people SQL or how to self-service en masse. Um, and I guess you were just talking about some of the gotchas as well. Are there any other gotchas or potholes that you think are worth mentioning as we think about kind of giving this skill set to our people?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already covered one of the primary ones of misinterpreting the data and then using that to make some type of decision that's poorly informed. But one other pitfall is as you open up the warehouse and you have models that are open to consumers throughout the company to start building on top of, you're kind of locked into those models now, right? And so change becomes a little bit difficult. And if there's a change that you need to make, oftentimes you have to test some of those downstream things that you didn't create, to make sure that your changes didn't break them. And that for me has been historically a bit challenging at times, especially when you want to make changes to the data pipeline of how that source data gets into your data warehouse. There are, like a popular tool like Fivetran. The schema might be slightly different than if you're using like an in-house solution, if you're using Meltano or a Singer Tap. So I think my point being is the more people are relying on that data and building things on top of that data,
Mhm.
the harder it is to be agile and change. Where if the data team has like kind of this fixed set of, we've got our project in source control that does the DBT transformations, we've got the look ML, and it's kind of under our control. We know exactly what to test when we make changes. And then if we do have other people hitting that data with different tools, it's a little harder to get that full view of what's the risk of the changes I'm making. It's not impossible, but it's just going to add time to the overall change control process.
Makes total sense. And yeah, I mean, I think as is often said, with comes great power, comes great responsibility, or whatever they said in Spider-Man. And I think that's in many ways what you're saying. Well, Meredith, we're over time, we're at time, however I want to say it. Thanks so much for joining to talk to us about SQL and everything SQL. I learned a bunch even just about the beginnings of SQL back in the 1970s that I actually had no idea, and I can't believe that SQL's 50th birthday is coming up next year. Do you know what day of the year? Do you know like the day of the year SQL is invented?
It was first presented, like, I think it was 1970 at an IBM conference when I can't remember what they called it. Was the initial onset of data warehousing, and it had kind of an interesting name, but it evolved over time. So I don't know if there's an actual date. I think Oracle was the first one to release it as a product,
Got
and that's where the 74 comes in.
So it's like that Oracle release date would be like SQL's 50th birthday party.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I guess if you wanted to celebrate the actual day, it's probably on the internet somewhere.
Yeah.
But
Well, I'll take a
yeah,
look at it. I'll take a look at it after we get off the show. And if it's a fun date, what we can do is next year I'll invite you back on the show. We'll do an episode like off of our normal schedule, and we can all raise a glass of champagne to SQL.
yeah, 50 years old.
Crazy. Well, Meredith, all jokes aside, thanks so much for joining. This was a lot of fun, and yeah, have a great rest of your day, and thank you to everyone for joining.
Yes, thank you.
All right, have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.